Wow, good morning. We got a good crowd here for something I'm really passionate about, which is app config. Uh, yeah, we got Kyle and Emily from Jamf here, and they're gonna let you all know what we're doing here at Jamf. So give them a big round of applause. Thank you.
Something virtual audience, what's up? Q&A at the end. You can get to it by going to the sidebar Q&A, find our session, answer questions there, and there will be comments and all that kind of stuff. I just want to make sure I'm putting that out too. We love you. Yeah, so this is Kyle.
Hi, I'm Kyle Hammond, a principal software engineer at Jamf. I've been with the company for 7.5 years now. I work on the Mac and iOS apps. I've worked on probably every one of them except Jamf Trust.
And I'm Dr. K. I am the manager of client platform engineering at Jamf. So we are the Jamf at Jamf team. We are the team that manage the entire Jamf stack of applications that are used by our own organization internally for business requirements. My team is up here too, which is awesome. Thank you guys for coming along. So let's just hop right into it. So we will get in. Okay, maybe let's do this. Raise of hands. How many of you know what managed app config is? Nice. These are our people. How many of you use managed app config of some kind in an app deployment in your organization? That's awesome. This is fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to walk through some scenarios and you're going to kind of nod your head. This is exactly why we do this, right? So imagine you're starting your first day at a new organization. Chances are you're spending most of that day setting up all your new stuff and getting signed into all of the apps you need to do your job. Wouldn't it be so nice if the apps knew who you were? Had automatic login information pre-populated when you launch, right? Make them easy to set up day one. Flip side. Imagine yourself as a me or a you. You can do that, I think. You're the endpoint admin at your organization, or you lead new hire orientation at your organization. You're trying to guide through your employees through that new setup experience on their devices. You have to teach them, here's the login for this, here's the login for this, your email is formatted like this, but your username on this thing is slightly different, leave off the domain, all that stuff, right? Wouldn't it be so nice to feed those settings and login information bits into an application to make that onboarding experience more streamlined for your end users, right? So enter managed app config, right? And that's a large part of what I would imagine our organizations, including our own organization, Jamf, uses them for. So in a nutshell, and this is from the Jamf developer docs, which you can find by going to developer.jamf.com. App config allows MDM solutions to remotely deliver data to a managed device, which can be used by the app to customize the user experience or app behavior. So it hits those scenarios that we were just discussing, right? How can we onboard easier? How can we make that flow better for our end users and help ourselves too, right? By making that experience better for our end users. So on today's agenda, we're going to cover what is managed app config, how it works, apps that support app config, probably not extensive list, but at least some core ones that I think a lot of the audience are going to recognize and you likely use at your own organizations. We'll take a look at some examples of how our team uses app config internally for our own employees at Jamf. And we will go through some practical app config considerations for app developers. Come on, there we go. Kyle is the guy for that. Y'all should be stoked that he's here to walk us through that because he knows this stuff inside and out. And we're happy to dig into this with you today. So I have a little more setup we'll do, and then we'll pass it back over to Kyle to talk a little bit more about some of the back-end stuff for managed app config. So let's dig into it. Basics, for managed app config, there need to be settings to manage the app with, right? You need at least iOS 7, tvOS 10.2, or macOS 11. Yes, macOS 11. And apps need to read the settings. And you're probably thinking, macOS 11? This is like a Mac thing too? It is. It's not just you thinking that. It does exist for macOS. So I'm sorry, I know I'm skipping around on my notes a little bit, and they're doing so well trying to keep up with me because I'm hopping around. So managed app config is available for macOS, starting with Big Sur. as some of you may imagine and are probably thinking about this a little bit, there are a lot of apps and MDM vendors that are, I will say, slow to adopt it. And I haven't seen it in anything quite yet. We were talking about this a little bit yesterday. I think it's mainly because managed preferences, like configuration profiles for macOS, are probably already largely deployed for applications you manage your environment. So then adding app config on top of that, maybe the value prop just isn't there yet, right? Jamf MDM products don't currently support managed app config, at least that I know of, right?
Yeah, not for macOS.
Yeah, so we'll probably talk a little bit more about that as we go. But in a nutshell, for an app to just use app config in general, all that needs to be there is settings just need to be built into NS user defaults, and it's com.apple.configuration manage dictionary. Don't worry, we'll dig into a lot of this later. But those are just some of the basics, like what this is, how you use it. Right? So some of the scenarios we hit before, right? What the value of managed app config really is, right? Pre-fill and ease of onboarding. I'd say that's probably the primary use of app config for a lot of applications. Can I figure out the user's email and just plop it into a field so that they don't have to do extra taps, right? Can I pre-fill a login URL for a service like Zoom so that they don't have to know where to go to sign in? It'll just be there for them, make it a little easier, right? Some apps as well, though, will actually have settings that can tighten security around corporate data. If you were at our BYO session a few days ago, app config is an important part of DLP for some apps, or forcing some apps to use a specific browser versus another to open links. There's a lot of that too, depending on if the app supports it. Because across the organization, you want a consistent starting point for people to interact with apps, right? You think about the burden that takes off of IT support or orientation leaders or other folks in the technology part of an organization when that information can already be there for the end user, so they don't have to write into the help desk and say, yeah, but is it my org or my org-prod or prod underscore a company that just acquired that I sign in, right? You can pre-fill that for them and make it easier. So we've set all that up, right? What the benefits are and what's largely used for. I'm going to hand it over to Kyle for the next section of our talk here.
Cool, thanks. So we're going to do a little activity, a little audience communication among yourselves. So now that you know what it is in general, we all use apps every day. So think of an app that you had to set up or that you support for your end users. That was like the hardest one for you to set up as an employee or for your customers to get going with. Maybe it has a lot of setup screens to walk through. You have to know the right URL or that domain that you have to set. And then turn to your neighbor, or if you're in the virtual audience, turn to a pet, maybe, if you're not with us. And we'll tell them what that app is. And we'll give you 30 seconds to complete this.
Now, go.
Go. Talk.
Talk amongst yourselves, please. Yeah. To our virtual friends, pick a question in the Q&A and just make a big thread of apps.
All right, we're getting close here. All right, can we bring it up here again, focus up here. Thanks for the participation, that's
Dang.
great.
Everyone's getting an A+ right now in participation. I love this. Sometimes you do it and then it's just like,
Yeah.
I hear y'all chatting. I dig it. That's very Thursday energy at the conference, and I appreciate it.
Very cool. So the chances are really good that either with improved app config, support from the app vendor, or with that proper configuration being sent by your management provider, that those setup workflows could really be improved, and that onboarding experience into that app could be a lot more seamless for your end users. So let's talk about apps. Several Jamf apps are on the iOS App Store that make use of managed app config. I want to call out Teacher and Student in particular because they automatically get a managed app config with settings from the Jamf School web console. So it's not something that you have to actually type in the XML. It's just some checkboxes, the way that you set up these apps in Jamf School, and that is pushed down with an app config. Also, Jamf Setup and Jamf Reset give the organizations really broad control over the whole UX of those apps. You can specify colors and images and the text that goes in that, so that those two apps can really feel like they're part of your organization. All of that is powered by app config. And all of those apps on that list there also interact with servers on the back end to provide a lot of the functionality of those apps. And app config sets up that server communication so end users don't have to do anything in some cases. Because those apps are on a managed device, it is completely functional as soon as the user launches the app. So here's some other apps that use managed app config. It's definitely not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of others. But here's some that we use at Jamf and are used really broadly. And from the management side of things, so the device management, both Jamf Pro and Jamf School support managed app config for iOS and tvOS apps. As we talked about, they don't support it for macOS yet. The app configuration in both of our products is presented as a text field where you type or copy paste XML. And we'll see some examples of that in a little bit. Now I'll hand it over to Emily to talk about how Jamf's internal IT department uses app config to help simplify some apps for employees like myself and to keep Jamf's corporate data more secure.
Yeah, let's dig into it. So a little bit about Jamf IT and Jamf at Jamf. We use the full stack of Jamf enterprise products for our own organization, so this will not surprise you. We use Jamf Pro, Jamf Connect, Unlock, Protect, and Trust. We use the Radar console. We have network threat prevention. We've got all the goodies. Unfortunately, all of the goodies from Jamf all use app config for our mobile deployments, which really helps a lot in what we do to not only make the use of those apps better for our employees, but also take some of the burden off of IT to handhold setting up some of those applications for our employees. We do manage both institutional and, shocker, BYO devices. It's just the only thing I've talked about all week with everybody. We rely very heavily on app config to customize the experience based on if an app is an institutional and supervised device or if it's a BYO device. And I will point out as an aside, we also use app config for BYO Android devices that we manage through Intune at Jamf. So it is a cross-platform thing as well for us. App config, honestly, is one of the most important parts of our mobile and BYO strategy, and you're going to get a sense of that, I think, as I walk through some of these applications. So let's just kind of dig into some examples of what we use internally. And I'm going to hop over to the one that we're probably all the most familiar with in the room, which is Jamf's self-service application. So this is a great example of an app configuration that most organizations use out of the box. Self-service, right? You'll see that in the app config provided in the documentation for Jamf Pro that the variables are used to pass device information between the app and the management server, as well as establish the correct URL of the management server. And you can see what's copied and pasted in here is right out of the docs. And y'all have probably done something very similar with your deployment. And you'll see here we've got these specific keys and strings that the application knows to use to determine what the Jamf Pro server URL and management ID is for that device. We'll talk about some more about variables and that kind of stuff later. So when you have the app config in place at that app installation, the end user will open self-service, and the self-service application will know what management server it needs to phone home to, what device is making the request, and then how to determine the scope for what to actually display in the application. So, for example, here is what our, come on. Oh, I'm gonna switch hands. Oh, I think they did it for me. Thank you. So this is actually what self-service looks like on a BYO device at Jamf. You'll see in here that it has our logo. It knows what server to talk to. It has the goodies for a BYO device in it, and it's able to do that because of the app config information that is set in that app deployment. So if you're lucky, the documentation of those key values is easy to find, and you can just copy and paste it for your managed app config, and you're good to go. If you're very, very lucky, it won't be locked behind a paywall or documentation behind a login. And I already see some of you rolling your eyes because you've probably run into this with apps that you're trying to support at your organization. So a lot of times you have to go spelunking to find what you need to do for those app config values, right? And so you go through the work to dig it out because you want to help yourself and help your end users. Not all vendors make it easy. So I'm going to use, and I love Slack. We're going to use Slack EMM as an example. We are a Slack shop. We use that as our primary communication tool at Jamf. If you use Slack EMM for mobile devices, you have a limited number of additional settings you can provide using app config to set up the app. When you find their documentation, it mentions the key and the value, but doesn't provide any formatting. Doesn't tell you how you're supposed to actually plug this stuff in. And if you are familiar with XML, it kind of makes sense, like how you should. Or you'll go to Jamf's documentation, you'll find XML for one of our apps, and then you'll just replace the keys and strings for the other app to kind of make it work with the formatting, right? Like we do with every script we find online. And I guess that makes sense, right? Every MDM is different, so they're not going to prescribe a specific way to format what you're supposed to use. And there was going to be this app config thing that was supposed to help with that, and gosh, that site needs a lot of love. Don't go to that link, it doesn't exist anymore, so sad. When we worked with Slack, and we were setting up enterprise grid for our own uses internally, we got this handy PDF, and it had all the key value pairs in it. The push behind that whole app config community in the site initially was to, one, make it easy to pull all this information together, both for administrators and for developers. But even that involved some detective work, depending on formatting, and it just never really kind of picked up and got caught on anywhere, unfortunately. So it's kind of on the vendors to supply that information to you in a way that's going to make the most sense. And depending on what vendor it is, it may make more or less sense on how I'm seeing nods, you understand. This one actually isn't too bad. You just need to know how to format the XML. It just in one column there's the key, it gives you a description, and then it gives you the value. But then sometimes it's like, yeah, but is the value, is it okay that there's a space in it? Is that gonna break something? And you kind of have to trust it and try to verify it with a test deployment, the whole thing. You know all this, you're IT admins, right? That's kind of how this rolls. So let me just show you what ours looks like. So for our, and yes, these are V11 screenshots. Hopefully y'all went down to the UX station in the expo hall and took a look. For those of you that are virtual and didn't get a chance to be there in person, get a little sense of what this looks like in a earlier version 11 UI. So this is our Slack EMM deployment for institutional mobile devices. And you'll see that our main focus here is just making app onboarding easier by we provide the org domain. We specify what domains are allowed to sign into the app at all, and that domain has to be there. You can't sign into any other domain. So I'm very sorry to our Jamf employees, you cannot sign into the Mac admin Slack in your Slack EMM app. You can only sign into Jamf's. It's a DLP consideration to copy paste between different workspaces. And you'll also see that approved device value of Slack app config. That's actually a value that the enterprise grid looks for from that application to determine if the device attempting the sign in is allowed to sign into your workspace. So this all comes from what Slack has provided to us. And then we just kind of had to figure out the appropriate way to format that in Jamf Pro for our deployment. If you want to hear more about that whole copy-paste DLP thing, go back and watch our BYO, How We BYO at Jamf session that happened earlier this week where we talk a bit more about our strategy there. And now we're going to take a look at our Slack EMM deployment for our BYO devices, which is different. And you'll notice we have additional key here, this browser control. For our user-enrolled devices, we want to try to keep all of our managed app traffic in managed apps, which we use Jamf Trust for per app VPN on for that connection. So to enforce that all the click traffic from Slack EMM goes through that per app VPN, we enforce that the browser Slack can use to load links is only a managed browser. And for us internally at Jamf, our BYO managed browser is Edge. So what this is telling Slack EMM is anytime someone copies a link, it must open an Edge. That's is an important part of not only our data policy, but also how we enforce all of our traffic over that per app VPN connection. So app config is what makes that possible. Without those values, we can't accomplish those things. So it's actually very critical to our security posture and to our end user onboarding experience to be able to do this in the first place. So let's talk about Edge, as I mentioned it before. Mobile apps from Microsoft services are actually really great about app config support and have extensive catalogs of values that you can enforce with app config to customize the app experience. But figuring out what they are and how to use them in Jamf Pro can be a little bit of an emotional roller coaster. So I'm going to take that ride with you right now. So I've got a QR code up there you can scan if you want to pull up some of Microsoft's documentation in their portal. It has an entire section just for Edge policies, which is great. But as you'd imagine, most of the documentation has a bias towards Intune. That's okay. I understand. I will not take it personally. Internally, when I talk about this with my colleagues at Jamf, how I refer to it as you have to go through some funky translations to figure out what requirements, like you need to implement some of these settings based on how it's in their documentation, like actually translate how they supply it into Jamf Pro language, if that's a way that resonates with you. So we'll take private browsing as an example. I think maybe I have a click here. Yeah, so because Edge is the managed browser with per app VPN for BYO devices, we actually don't want the private browsing option to be in the application because technically it doesn't work. All of the app traffic is over the per app VPN connection. It's not private browsing. So we disable private browsing so that people know that IT has locked it down because all your traffic is going over our tunnel anyway. To turn that off, we have to set this key in private mode availability 1, which means false. Okay, so let me show you. Okay, so you go to the documentation, you're like, okay, private mobile policy reference, cool, private browsing, and I dig through and I'm like, okay, note on iOS, if the policy is changed, okay, cool, fine, 0 equals in private mode available, 1 equals in private mode disabled, 2 in private mode forced. And it's all in one line. There's no commas or semicolons or bullet points or anything, and you have to go, okay, I wasn't an English major, but they probably could have done a better job with this. And it's an integer. Can you just say false or true or something? Like, surely there's a better way to do this. But I'm guessing there's an Intune reason for that. But I'm at Jamf, and I work with Jamf Pro, so I'm going to complain anyway. But, you know, like it could be better. Yeah, for those of you that maybe couldn't see that close up. Do I have more notes on this screen? I remember. Okay, so point being, depending on the vendor, how you get the app config values can vary greatly. And then you've got to do your detective work to figure out how exactly you're supposed to use it. A little bit of cat and mouse, Sherlock, magnifying lens, trial and error, whatever metaphor resonates with you, right? To get it right. But, you know, once you implement it, it's actually pretty cool to see it working the way that you spec'd. So, like, when you actually have it configured correctly on the app, you'll see your IT administrator has blocked in private browsing on this device, and app config is what enables that functionality, which I think is pretty cool. Like, I just love seeing things work. Maybe that's just a basic IT thing, but I love when I put a thing in and it works the way that I need it to. One thing I do want to make sure that I give kudos to the documentation from Microsoft is, there we go. If you look under supported features on this page, you'll see dynamic policy refresh, yes. So depending on the application, it will pick up setting changes on the fly. So if you go into your deployment in Pro and you change the value and click save, and then the phone gets the new app config pulled down, some apps require you close and reopen them to pick up the new settings and the change in the settings. Some of them will apply the policy ongoing. So dynamic policy refresh here is telling me that if I go in and I change this value, the application, as soon as it gets the setting update, will immediately enforce it. So it is very helpful when vendors do specify if that's the case or not. Not all of them do.
Hey, Emily, is it okay if we skip past the Confluence Cloud stuff?
Yeah.
We're running a
I'll
little
click
short
through.
on
We're
time.
running a little. Are we running a little short on time? I guess
We
we
wanna
are.
have
We've
some
got a few more
Q&A,
things.
yeah.
We want time for Q&A. Yeah. So I'll just show you Confluence real quick. It's very simple for onboarding. It gives you the ability to pull in the user's email address, so that when you go to the app for the first time, it'll pull your email address in, and then you don't have to type it all out. You just tap through, which is really cool. And I mean, this is just, hey, log in. Yes, I want to log in. And look, my email's already there. I didn't have to type it in, thank goodness. And then if you have FastPass at your org, you don't even have to type in a password. It just gets you right through. It's really wonderful. Go back and watch Matt Velasquez's session earlier today on all the cool stuff happening with identity. So, all right. Overview of what we use, just some examples of apps, and I would imagine there are folks in the room and on the virtual that use these apps: Confluence, Google, Jamf stuff, obviously, Salesforce, Okta, Microsoft stuff, no shocker there. At that point, I'm gonna hand it back over to Kyle, and we've got another activity.
All right, thanks for all the participation on the first activity. So now that you know what Managed App Config could do, think about that app that you heard about before in our first activity. And what do you know if that app supports app config? How would you find out? How do you know? Do you know if your IT department is configuring that app right now? Or maybe you could make that a lot easier and get something a little better for your end users. So I would like you to, if it clicks, I would like you to create a reminder for yourself to investigate more, or tell, well, there you go, or tell your neighbors about the thing that you would do, that app, and how you'd investigate or improve your app config. And we'll give you about a minute.
A minute.
Maybe
Go.
less, 30 seconds.
Online attendees, pick a thread in the Q&A and just chat about what reminders you're setting. Got one question. That's a good one.
All right. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to go through this at lightning speed. We're going to do some practical managed app configuration for app developers. If your organization produces apps, or if you work with third-party vendors who produce apps that you use, which is like everybody probably in this room, they want to, this section is for you. So, as an app, what do you need to do? You need to decide what needs to be configured. As we've seen, you could configure things like setting up those setup screens, the onboarding workflow. You can also configure things for improved security. If your app is available on the App Store for personal use, that's great. And then organizations might want some different controls around that and different ease of use things for app config. The next thing is deciding whether those settings should be adjustable by the user. I know you're thinking, what? Adjustable by the user? Why would they do that? There might be some consistency things, some of those setup steps that, you know, initially the user might be given the option to choose dark mode or light mode or a different kind of background or color settings or something. And maybe those things pick up the default from the organization, but then let the users change it afterwards. And then the last thing that they really need to decide is how they're going to deploy those things. Do you want two apps? That's what Slack did. There's a Slack personal, like just Slack, and then there's Slack EMM. So there's two apps on the App Store. Other places like Microsoft built all of the app config into their one app. There's just the Microsoft Outlook, and it has the app config settings in it. So you have to choose. Lots of pros and cons to both, but it really is up to you. And then one last point about the managed app config itself is that that information being sent down to the device is not stored in a secure manner on iOS, tvOS, or macOS. So on iOS or tvOS, it is harder to access those files. But on macOS, it's really easy. You can just go in and look at the information that's in your app config on macOS. So no secrets. Once you have that app config, potential customers want to know about it. That's you trying to find that. As Emily showed, you have to like dig around on the internet and figure out how those things work. So you want to communicate the app strategy, the one app or the two apps. Do organizations need to download a separate app, or is it that same app that has those settings? And then, of course, documenting the keys and values is super important. From a programming level, those things show up in user defaults. Now, if you're not a developer, that's okay. Mac and iOS developers will know what I'm talking about on this slide. They appear in user defaults. It's a standard API. It'll be a dictionary of keys and values under com.apple.configuration.managed. And in order to make that even easier for app developers, Jamf has an open source library on GitHub called managed app config lib. And that will make it much easier to just adopt this, and it works great with Swift UI apps. It automatically will refresh and listen for new app config information coming in. It also works with UIKit and AppKit, and it has good documentation too. Now this is one that we wanted to go into a little bit, don't have a lot of time, but app config variable substitution works in both Jamf Pro and Jamf School. They are slightly formatted differently. Jamf Pro uses $, all caps with maybe underscores, and Jamf School uses % surrounding those values, but that is a per device substitution. So it can be some things like the Jamf Pro has a JPS underscore URL. That is the URL of your Jamf Pro server, so that if devices need to phone home to your server to do things, they know what that is. But device name is device specific. So anytime those variables come through in an app config, the Jamf Pro and Jamf School servers will interpret it for that specific device. Another really advanced topic, if the apps want to get the latest app config, like the app itself can be coded to maybe affect systems that are changing the values that might show up in there. Maybe they're doing things with LDAP servers or extension attributes, and they want to get the latest and greatest app config from the server with the latest variables from current data. You can set up that with a token, a one-time use token, and the app itself can hit this API, and the server will know what app it was on what device, and it will resend a new app config with the latest variables to that app on that specific device. So that is it for our content. The key takeaways, there are organizational settings that can ease the onboarding and improve security as well. Documentation is key. As an app developer, don't hide it. This can actually be a great marketing ploy for your app. You support enterprises. There's a lot of apps out there that enterprises get to choose from. If you show that you support enterprises and make it easy for them, guess what? You're going to get volume sales.
Enterprises have money sometimes, most of the time. You don't. Hint, hint, app developers.
All right. Let's go to the
Q&A. Thank you for joining us on this session. I am now taking off my presenter hat and putting my Q&A moderator hat on. You're welcome, and I'm sorry. I'll do my best to not only do some of the questions that we've gotten through the Q&A in the app, but also let y'all in person ask some questions. I want to lead with one or two from here to start, because we already kind of chatted about how we probably want to answer some of them. One is going to make you laugh, and it's already making me laugh, which is, could Jamf maintain a community aggregated database of app config?
That is appconfig.org.
We tried.
And yes, we have heard that, and we are trying to actually get appconfig.org sort of centralized within Jamf, but it is its own org, and it's legal and other hurdles.
The DNS is owned by
Mobile Iron or VMware?
Ivanti?
Ivanti, there you go.
I think. Last I checked. So yeah, that we tried. A bunch of developers tried when it was first announced, and then no one watered the garden. We need someone to come in and pull some weeds and maybe move the garden to a sunnier spot. Is that a good metaphor? I'm never quite sure. Yeah, so Here's another one. This is one we chatted about and answered a little bit between the two of us. What is the difference between app config and configuration profiles for macOS, and is there a reason to use one over the other?
Okay, let me first say that app config for macOS is, as far as I know, not supported by any MDM vendor. So that's a good reason not to use it. Secondly, the actual technical difference, if MDM vendors actually supported it, would be that app config can go along with the install application command, so the app config settings are there when the application is installed. The managed preferences that has been around since like macOS 10.7, I think, is a separate configuration profile, and the install app is a separate thing. So maybe your app is there without any settings, and the user could launch it, but your configuration profile hasn't hit the Mac yet, and so it could launch with no settings. But again, no MDM vendor that I know of actually supports app config for macOS. So.
You would like to add on to the question, sure, and I'll repeat it for the folks listening at home.
Yep.
Is this the question? What is the future of app config for macOS? Will we see support on Jamf Pro 11? Wink, wink.
Wink, wink. Jamf Pro 11 will not have macOS MDM app config. However,
okay. I want to say it's not on the roadmap at this time, but submit feature requests, but I don't even know if I have the executive authority to say that.
I think submit feature requests is the great part of that.
Yeah.
If you all want to see that on there, let us know. Because honestly, that is how we prioritize things, is how many people actually want to use this. Yeah. And obviously the other part of that is that the Mac apps actually have to support app config, because it is a code change, right? They have to use that com.apple.configuration.managed key to look for those settings. So it's not just the MDM vendors that don't support it.
Yeah.
The app vendors have been like not supporting it either.
I would say, and I mentioned this a little bit on Tuesday at the BYO session, I think that this new kind of concept of account-driven device enrollment for macOS, this kind of BYO model for macOS, akin to account-driven user enrollment and device enrollment for iOS, where someone takes a personal device and enrolls it based on their identity, and the APFS volume for a managed work partition is created, could provide, app config I think would provide value there, because the installation of the settings comes with the app from management and would hopefully not manage that preference for the entire Mac, just for the work partition that includes that application. That's me spitballing. I don't know anything. I'm just the IT person. But like, I could see the value being there. So like, if BYO for macOS is something that you see your organization finding value in, maybe for contractors or contingent workers or students or whatever the case may be, I would file that feedback and make sure you talk about those use cases and the scale of them at your organization, because that really helps our product folks determine how they should prioritize looking into adding that functionality.
Yeah, and I'll tag on to that. Also talk to the app vendors.
Yes.
So if you have Mac apps that you are installing and it would ease onboarding or security, or there are other uses of app config too, branding and that sort of thing. All of those things, it's up to the developer of the app to actually make it and then tell you about it in a sane way.
I just want to say that there is a comment in here about the video online being frozen right after the garden metaphor. And then there was a comment that said, I tried refreshing and replayed the garden metaphor and it froze again. And I love that the garden metaphor is now a thing. I can't really answer that, but I'm gonna say that it's answered to move it down in the queue. Let's take a second to pull the room. Are there any questions from anyone in the audience that you'd like to ask? A little right up here. All right, there's one here, and I'll repeat it. Okay. Mm-hmm. Deployments. Yeah, Yeah, I wanted to let him finish. So I think that the question is, let's say that I'm deploying an application to different regions or different sites or different, whatever the case may be, where the settings that would pre-populate from that config are different. And what you would do is I'll use Jamf Pro as an example. You could use scoping to deploy the application with a different app config. So you would have multiple app deployments with different app configs. That's the approach we use with institutional or supervised versus BYO for some of our deployments. So yes, it'll only apply because iOS only supports one app bundle of an app on a device at any given time. You can only have one Outlook client, for example, on the device at the time, regardless of if it was installed from management or personally. There can only be one, so that managed app config is going to apply to that one app because it's all that's there. Did that help answer your question? Cool. I'll go with this one on here. It says, is it possible to deploy config to an app that is already installed, or do you have to delete and push again?
All right.
It depends. There's a
Yeah.
lot of variables there.
So if it's already a managed app, like you installed that managed app through MDM, but you didn't have an app config on it, you can go into the app record in Jamf Pro or similar in Jamf School, and you can type in the app config and hit save, and it will redeploy the app config to that managed app. Now, if you're trying to take over management of an app that was installed by the end user or maybe installed by a package that wasn't MDM, maybe we didn't mention this. Managed app config is for MDM apps. Like, it's not for policies or packages that are installed outside of MDM. It is for MDM managed apps.
Yeah, and the Jamf Pro UI in particular tries to make that clear, I would imagine, by making that app config field in the app deployment for that app. It's all together. Right. It's just for that application.
Yeah, and that comes from the App Store.
Right.
So, super important point there.
Then maybe on the continuing question of like you can, but then on the whole, we mentioned Edge and refresh of policy, dynamic policy refresh. It largely depends on the app itself. If it'll actually pick up that there's a config there now, you may have to delete and reinstall the app or close and reopen the app to get the app to refresh and pull the new settings.
Yeah, and it's mainly that second thing. If the user is running the app right now, or if it's a kiosk in single app mode or something, if you push new app config to it, the app has to be written to listen for those changes. It can be, and if you use that managed app config lib that we have on GitHub, that makes it really simple for it to listen and tell your app that, hey, there's a new setting, go do something different. But it is an app-specific code change to do those things.
Are there any other questions in the room? Okay, I've got one here that you may be able to answer. If you can get your hands on an iOS app binary, can you inspect it for app config support? Is there an equivalent of looking for, a way, like it says for an SDEF to establish AppleScript support in a Mac app?
Unfortunately, no. One of the things that we tried to do with appconfig.org was to create that thing. There's a file that you can create as an app developer that you can specify the keys and values and descriptions of the things that your app supports. It's, I think, has to be XML because it was, 2017, I think, when we came up with that. And that was meant to be that central catalog. Like app developers could make that thing and upload it to appconfig.org, and then all these MDM vendors would be able to pull that and use that as the central database of all the cool settings, and then they can make widgets instead of copy-paste XML. You could have checkboxes and text fields and things. It was a grand vision that never really came to it, and specifically inside of the app, there is nothing that is, certainly nothing mandated by Apple, which would force it, but there's nothing even in the developer community that is doing that.
I got a question that's kind of like an IT related, specifically IT related question, like operational thing. So, and about Jamf, so I can answer that. If connections to Jamf domains must go through the corporate tunnel to Edge, how do your support personnel and engineers effectively troubleshoot issues reported by customers? Are they allowed to bypass it, or do they need a separate computer? So we have Jamf Trust on our managed Macs, and the connections are just based on services that are being accessed. It's not a full device VPN tunnel like a per app tunnel would be on an app on iOS. I can't really speak to technical support workflows. I don't imagine a ton of them sit only on a BYO phone with DLP between managed and unmanaged applications supporting their customers. They have Macs at their disposal. They have other devices. A lot of them also have institutional devices where all of the traffic is going over Jamf Trust, so there's a difference there. But to whoever asked that question, if you're here or if you want to ping me on Slack, we could probably talk about it a little bit more. But the behavior is different between iOS and macOS for some of that stuff, just to answer that. What video fraud challenge? We probably have time for like one more question. There was one that was about, where was it? Name changes are tricky. That's probably a longer answer than what we could probably talk about in a Q&A. As you all know, as IT practitioners, name changes have just been the biggest bugaboo since the beginning of time. Does app config support Jamf variables like configuration profiles?
Yes, in general. The variable substitution you can find on our documentation for Jamf Pro and Jamf School, and it is essentially the same list of variables. So you can get things like extension attribute values, you can get a bunch of things like the Jamf Pro server, the device ID, the device name, the user's email address. I think it has building support and a bunch of other things. So yeah, it's basically the same list of variables that you can put into configuration profiles.
Cool. I think we'll call it there. We're about 1 minute over, but hey, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Kyle, for putting up with me. Thank you to our virtual audience. Let us know if you have any other questions. We'll see you around in the hallway track.